In the rural Alabama landscape, Sallie Crane was born into a world that she would never have chosen. Her life began in the dark shadows of a system designed to strip her of her humanity, her identity, and any hope of a future defined by freedom or dignity. The year of her birth is lost to history, but it is certain that Sally's earliest memories were marked by the brutal realities of slavery, an institution that gripped the South with an iron fist, reshaping the lives of millions, especially the women whose lives were molded by the whims of their enslavers. From the moment she drew her first breath, Sally was enslaved. She was born into the grips of an unforgiving world, where Black people, especially women, had no agency over their bodies, their choices, or even their very lives. Slavery was not merely an economic system in Alabama. It was a deeply ingrained way of life, a social structure that dehumanized millions and kept them bound to the land through sheer violence and terror. Sally's early life on the plantation was one of hardship, constant labor, and an ever-present fear of punishment. Enslaved children were not allowed the luxury of childhood. From a very young age, Sally would have been tasked with grueling chores, working in the fields or in the house alongside other enslaved women. The work was backbreaking, from picking cotton under the harsh Alabama sun to caring for the house, cooking, cleaning, and maintaining the needs of the enslavers. Her body was not her own, and every waking moment was consumed with labor designed to sustain the lifestyle of her masters. The work was grueling and unrelenting, and the long hours of labor left no room for rest or the possibility of a future outside the bounds of slavery. For children like Sally, the idea of family was tenuous at best. Enslaved families were constantly at risk of being torn apart, as they could be sold at any time to different slave owners. Children, as young as babies, were often ripped from their mother's arms, never to see them again. The trauma of separation was a constant undercurrent in the lives of enslaved people. Sally would have witnessed this heartbreak firsthand, as families were broken apart like fragile pieces of glass. Mothers wept for their children, fathers for their wives, and siblings for one another. The anxiety of this threat cast a long shadow over the lives of those like Sally, who had no control over their fate. Yet even in this environment of hardship, moments of connection still flickered. The bonds Sally formed with fellow enslaved people were perhaps the only source of emotional survival. They became her family, sharing not just labor, but laughter, stories, and hope in the face of terror. In those quiet, stolen moments when the overseer's whip was not nearby, they found strength in each other. A kind word, a shared piece of food, the solidarity in knowing that they were not alone. These moments were vital in keeping their spirits intact. Sally learned early on that while her body was bound by chains, her spirit could still reach for freedom in the form of camaraderie and shared resistance. As the years passed, Sally's mind began to expand beyond the confines of the plantation. Her youthful heart began to yearn for something more than the endless toil and the constant threat of punishment. She began to hear whispers from older enslaved people, those who had once tried to escape or had heard tales of others who had succeeded. These stories were dangerous, for they raised hopes that could easily be crushed under the boot of the enslaver. But they also planted the seeds of rebellion in her heart. The idea of freedom, though distant and impossible for most, began to take root in her mind. Still, Sally was acutely aware of the risks. She had seen the consequences of attempts to escape: brutal beatings, disfigurement, even death. Escape was not just a physical journey, it was a death sentence for many who failed, and the idea of running was often as terrifying as staying behind. The plantation system had its ways of discouraging even the thought of rebellion: guards, dogs, and the ever-watchful eyes of the overseers. But despite the grave consequences, Sally's desire to escape began to take hold in her soul. She had seen enough to know that the chains of slavery were not just physical, they were emotional, psychological, and spiritual. The thought of living and dying in bondage without ever knowing what freedom felt like was becoming more unbearable with each passing year. The first inklings of escape appeared in the quietest moments, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the air grew cool with the promise of night. It was in those hushed hours, when Sallie lay awake in the dark, that her dreams of freedom blossomed. She would close her eyes and imagine herself walking away from the plantation, stepping into a world where she could breathe without fear, where she could walk under the stars without the terror of being hunted. But Sallie was no fool. She understood the harsh reality of attempting to escape. The stories of the brave souls who had tried before were not just stories of success, they were filled with loss and sacrifice. Even if she managed to escape, where would she go? What would she eat? How would she survive in a world that had no place for someone like her? These questions weighed heavily on her mind, but the need for freedom slowly outweighed the fear. It was not just the physical torment of slavery that crushed the spirits of those who lived under its rule, it was the emotional and psychological toll. Slaves were not considered human in the eyes of many, and their worth was determined only by the amount of labor they could provide. This institutionalized dehumanization made it nearly impossible for individuals to maintain their sense of self-worth. Yet, through the support of fellow enslaved people, some, including Sallie, were able to hold on to a piece of their dignity. They fought back against this system by simply surviving, by finding moments of joy and solace where they could. They celebrated birthdays and weddings in secret, and shared stories and songs that spoke of their longing for a better world. Sallie's life was a constant tug of war between survival and the desire for escape. She had witnessed the horrors of slavery, the brutal whippings, the emotional scars, and the systematic breaking down of families. She had seen the toll it took on mothers, fathers, and children, all of whom were subject to the whims of an uncaring system. Yet amidst this devastation, Sallie also witnessed small acts of resistance. These acts, though seemingly insignificant, were a quiet defiance of the system that sought to control every aspect of her life. Whether it was sneaking food to a friend or speaking out against an unjust punishment, these small acts of rebellion were seeds of the larger resistance that would eventually take root in her heart. As Sallie matured, the realization began to crystallize in her mind. Escape was not just a fantasy, it was the only hope she had for a future. The chains of slavery, both physical and emotional, were too strong to endure forever. She began to see that there was only one way to claim her life back. She would have to run, to leave behind everything she had known in search of something better. This first session ends with Sallie's quiet understanding that freedom, though distant and dangerous, was still possible. The desire for escape, though a faint whisper, had now become a clear and powerful voice in her heart. In a world that sought to break her, Sallie's spirit remained unbroken. And though she did not yet know how she would escape, she knew deep down that it would be the only way she could ever be truly free.
The yearning for freedom burned relentlessly in Sallie's heart, a flame that could never be extinguished by the oppressive reality of slavery. It was a fire that simmered in her soul, undying and determined, even in the darkest hours of her existence. Each day she endured the crushing weight of forced labor, the brutal punishments, and the emotional toll of being torn from her family and subjected to the whims of her enslavers. The thought of escaping, of stepping outside the chains of her servitude, became more than a dream. It became a necessity. The desire for freedom was not a fleeting wish, but a powerful need that consumed her thoughts, fueling her every decision and action. Sallie's first escape was not a sudden decision. It was born from months, even years, of careful observation and quiet preparation. She had seen others try to escape before her, some succeeding, but many failing. The failures were often the most visible, as the punishments for trying to flee were swift and severe. Sally knew that to escape, she would need more than courage. She would need knowledge, strategy, and an understanding of the risks involved. The harsh lesson of seeing others caught only heightened the stakes, but it also revealed a way forward. Over time, Sally began to carefully observe her surroundings. She watched the rhythms of the plantation, learning the routines of the overseers and the ebb and flow of labor. The overseers were her biggest concern, and she studied their patterns intently. She noted the times when they were least attentive, when they took breaks, or when they were distracted by their own conversations or their own indulgences. She learned when the guards' eyes would wander, when the dogs were too tired to chase, or when the nights were long and the moonlight provided enough cover for a swift escape. Sally also began to pay attention to the stories of others who had attempted to escape or knew someone who had tried. The network of resistance was hidden within the plantation, scattered between the whispers shared in the dead of night or the hushed voices behind closed doors. These enslaved individuals formed a clandestine web of support, sharing crucial information on possible routes to freedom, the best times to attempt an escape, and the locations where runaway slaves might find shelter. This informal network became an essential lifeline, offering knowledge that Sally could use to her advantage. She learned about secret hiding spots in nearby woods, about sympathetic people who might help her along the way, and about the treacherous paths she would have to navigate to escape the plantation's watchful eye. The risks of escape were impossible to ignore. Sally knew the fate that awaited those who were caught. The punishments for attempting to flee were brutal and often deadly. There was no mercy for runaways. If she were caught, she would likely face a public whipping, severe beatings, and perhaps even be chained or locked away in a dark cell to further break her spirit. The consequences of failure were so extreme that many enslaved people, despite their desires for freedom, chose to remain where they were, no matter how unbearable their situation might seem. But Sally was different. Her hope for freedom was stronger than her fear of the consequences. The night of her first escape came unexpectedly. It was a quiet night with no wind to stir the trees and the moon hanging high in the sky, casting a soft, ghostly light over the plantation. Sally had carefully waited for this moment, watching for signs that it was the right time. She had learned enough to know that this night, this moment, might be her only chance. With her heart pounding in her chest, Sally slipped from her quarters and into the darkness. She moved swiftly but quietly, her feet making no sound as she crept through the fields, making her way toward the dense woods that bordered the plantation. Her mind raced, her every step fraught with fear and anticipation. She had never been so close to freedom, but with every step, the danger of being caught grew greater. The fear of being discovered lurked in the shadows, but the thought of being free, of walking away from the plantation forever, spurred her onward. The night felt both endless and too brief, as though time itself had slowed down to match the intensity of her escape. Each step she took felt monumental, a defiant act against the system that had bound her for so long. But despite the progress she made, Sally knew that she was not truly free. The journey ahead was fraught with uncertainty. She had no map, no clear direction, and no certainty that she would find safety or shelter. The world beyond the plantation was unknown, hostile, and dangerous. She could only trust in her instincts and the fleeting knowledge she had gathered. Days passed, and the journey grew more difficult. Sally had to rely on her wits and resourcefulness to survive. She foraged for food in the woods, berries, roots, and anything she could find to quiet the gnawing hunger that threatened to consume her. But with each passing day, her hope of reaching freedom began to fade. She was running low on food, and the exhaustion from days of travel was beginning to take its toll. The mental strain was even worse. The ever-present fear of being caught weighed heavily on her mind, and she began to question her decision to flee. It wasn't long before her worst fears were realized. After days of travel, she encountered a group of slave catchers who had been alerted to her escape. They were experienced, ruthless men who knew how to track runaway slaves, and Sally had no way to escape. The chase was short, and before long, she was caught. Her heart sunk as the reality of her failure settled in. Her first attempt at freedom had ended in failure. She was returned to the plantation in chains, her body battered and bruised from the rough treatment, her spirit broken by the bitter taste of defeat. The punishment for her escape was severe. Sallie was publicly whipped, the lashes cutting into her flesh as a reminder to others who might think to follow her example. But despite the physical pain, Sallie's resolve did not break. The punishment was cruel, but it only strengthened her resolve. She had seen the possibility of freedom with her own eyes, and she knew now that it was not an impossible dream. Her first escape had shown her that freedom was attainable, even if the path was fraught with peril. The harshness of her punishment could not extinguish the flame of hope that had been ignited within her. Her first escape, though not successful, would not be her last. The fire for freedom that burned within her had only grown stronger, and Sallie was more determined than ever to break free from the chains of slavery. After her failed escape, Sallie Crane found herself back in the familiar but loathsome grip of the plantation, a place that had once been her home but had become a prison. The very air felt oppressive, thick with the weight of loss and hopelessness. She was subjected to even greater surveillance than before, her every move watched by the overseers, whose eyes seemed to follow her every step. But the scrutiny she faced was not the thing that haunted her most. It was the thought of her children, the pain of being separated from them, the knowledge that they were enduring the same brutal system of oppression that she had was more than she could bear. Enslaved women like Sallie often had their children taken from them at a moment's notice. Once a child was born, the enslavers viewed them as property, no different from livestock or tools. The children of enslaved mothers were vulnerable to being sold to other plantations, torn away from their mothers, and scattered like fragments of a shattered life. This was a constant, heart-wrenching fear that hung over every enslaved family. Sallie, like so many others, had seen families broken apart in an instant, with mothers crying for their lost children, fathers helpless to protect their families. The thought of her own children being taken away from her was unbearable, yet it was an ever-present reality. During her time on the plantation, Sallie had been separated from her children. The masters had sold them, or perhaps the overseers had moved them to another part of the estate. Whatever the reason, Sallie's heart ached with the absence of their small faces, their voices, and their touch. She had no idea where they were, whether they were still alive or if they were enduring the same hardships she had faced. The separation from her children was an agony that no amount of work, no amount of discipline, or even the constant labor could soothe. She longed for them every day, the pain of being apart growing with each passing moment. Sallie's heart broke whenever she thought of them, but it was this pain that drove her to act. It was no longer just about her own freedom, it was about them. They were her anchor, her reason for enduring the suffering of slavery, and her reason for fighting. The love she had for her children was fierce, unyielding, and it became the single most powerful force in her life. She could not bear the thought of them living in suffering under the same brutal system that had enslaved her. The idea of them being subjected to a life of forced labor, degradation, and cruelty without a chance at freedom was a nightmare too great to imagine. For Sallie, the thought of them being torn away from her again, or worse, being lost to the system forever, was the driving force behind her next escape attempt. The very act of escaping no longer seemed to be a solitary journey for her own freedom. It was a desperate mission to rescue her children from a fate far worse than the one she had known. She would risk everything, not just for her life, but for theirs. The decision to leave the plantation once more was not just about her personal need for freedom. It was about reclaiming her children and giving them the chance at a life free from bondage. This realization imbued Sallie with a determination that transcended her own fear, a resolve that was fueled by the love and protection she felt for her children. Sallie knew that attempting to escape again was a dangerous and life-threatening choice. She had failed once, and the consequences for failure were grave. If she were caught again, the punishments would be even more brutal. The overseers would make an example of her to deter others from following suit. Yet the fear of punishment was no longer the primary concern for Sallie. Her children were the focus of her every thought, and the urgency of bringing them to freedom drowned out all other fears. To leave them in slavery, to know they would never experience a life without the horrors of bondage, was simply not an option. In the days following her failed escape, Sallie began quietly formulating her plan. She had already gathered the knowledge and skills she needed from her first attempt, learning to navigate the world outside the plantation, how to read the landscape, and how to move under the cover of night. But this time, her plan was different. It wasn't just about escaping for herself, it was about rescuing her children. She would need to learn their whereabouts, to track them down, and to figure out how to bring them to safety. The task seemed impossible, but Sallie was driven by a fierce determination to reunite with them, no matter the cost. She began by gathering information from the other enslaved individuals on the plantation. She quietly asked about the location of her children, trying to piece together any clues that might lead her to them. She spoke with the older enslaved women who might have seen her children, or those who worked in the house, whose proximity to the enslavers gave them information that others did not have. She had to be careful. Her questions could easily draw suspicion if the wrong person overheard them, but every conversation, every whispered word brought her closer to finding her children. Sallie also began to observe the routines of the overseers, studying their patterns with a level of intensity that matched her sense of urgency. She knew that her first attempt had failed due to the vigilance of the overseers, and she would need to be more strategic this time. She noted the times when the overseers were less attentive, the moments when they were preoccupied with their own business, or when the shifts changed. She studied the patrol routes, the locations where the dogs were kept, and the potential escape routes that could take her to her children and beyond. She also gathered information from the network of enslaved people who had helped her before, learning of places where runaway slaves could hide, people who could offer food, and paths that were less likely to be patrolled. As Sallie plotted her escape, she knew the risks were greater than before. The plantation was more closely monitored, and the consequences of being caught would be severe. But the thought of her children's suffering pushed her forward. She wouldn't allow them to live out their lives in servitude. The system of slavery had torn so many families apart, but Sallie was determined to defy it. Her connection to her children became the heartbeat of her plan. Every step she took in preparing for her escape was fueled by the singular goal of reuniting with them. The sacrifices, the pain, the risks, none of it mattered compared to the possibility of holding her children again, of offering them a chance at a life free of bondage. This realization imbued Sallie with a determination that transcended her own fear, a resolve that was fueled by the love and protection she felt for her children. Sallie knew that attempting to escape again was a dangerous and life-threatening choice. She had failed once, and the consequences for failure were grave. If she were caught again, the punishments would be even more brutal. The overseers would make an example of her to deter others from following suit. Yet the fear of punishment was no longer the primary concern for Sallie. Her children were the focus of her every thought, and the urgency of bringing them to freedom drowned out all other fears. To leave them in slavery, to know they would never experience a life without the horrors of bondage, was simply not an option. In the days following her failed escape, Sallie began quietly formulating her plan. She had already gathered the knowledge and skills she needed from her first attempt, learning to navigate the world outside the plantation, how to read the landscape, and how to move under the cover of night. But this time, her plan was different. It wasn't just about escaping for herself, it was about rescuing her children. She would need to learn their whereabouts, to track them down, and to figure out how to bring them to safety. The task seemed impossible, but Sallie was driven by a fierce determination to reunite with them, no matter the cost. She began by gathering information from the other enslaved individuals on the plantation. She quietly asked about the location of her children, trying to piece together any clues that might lead her to them. She spoke with the older enslaved women who might have seen her children, or those who worked in the house, whose proximity to the enslavers gave them information that others did not have. She had to be careful. Her questions could easily draw suspicion if the wrong person overheard them, but every conversation, every whispered word brought her closer to finding her children. Sallie also began to observe the routines of the overseers, studying their patterns with a level of intensity that matched her sense of urgency. She knew that her first attempt had failed due to the vigilance of the overseers, and she would need to be more strategic this time. She noted the times when the overseers were less attentive, the moments when they were preoccupied with their own business, or when the shift changed. She studied the patrol routes, the locations where the dogs were kept, and the potential escape routes that could take her to her children and beyond. She also gathered information from the network of enslaved people who had helped her before, learning of places where runaway slaves could hide, people who could offer food, and paths that were less likely to be patrolled. As Sallie plotted her escape, she knew the risks were greater than before. The plantation was more closely monitored, and the consequences of being caught would be severe. But the thought of her children's suffering pushed her forward. She wouldn't allow them to live out their lives in servitude. The system of slavery had torn so many families apart, but Sallie was determined to defy it. Her connection to her children became the heartbeat of her plan. Every step she took in preparing for her escape was fueled by the singular goal of reuniting with them. The sacrifices, the pain, the risks, none of it mattered compared to the possibility of holding her children again, of offering them a chance at a life free of bondage. This realization imbued Sallie with a determination that transcended her own fear, a resolve that was fueled by the love and protection she felt for her children. Sallie knew that attempting to escape again was a dangerous and life-threatening choice. She had failed once, and the consequences for failure were grave. If she were caught again, the punishments would be even more brutal. The overseers would make an example of her to deter others from following suit. Yet the fear of With her children still haunting her every thought, Sallie Crane embarked on her second escape, more determined than ever. The pain of separation from them, the unbearable fear of their suffering, and the deep, unyielding love she had for them fueled her resolve. But this time, she knew that her journey would be far more treacherous than the first. Her heart was not just set on saving herself, but on reclaiming her children from a life of endless suffering. Freedom, however, was a far cry from anything she had ever known, and the path ahead was fraught with danger, uncertainty, and hardship. The lessons from her first escape were etched deeply into her memory. Sallie had learned the hard way how crucial it was to leave no trace behind, to move with stealth and caution. Her first attempt had been reckless in its desperation, and while the courage was commendable, it had lacked the careful strategy necessary for survival in such a dangerous world. This time, Sallie understood the consequences of failure all too well. She could not afford to be reckless. If she failed again, the punishment would be even worse than the first. Her fear of returning to the plantation, of facing even harsher conditions, and the loss of her children forever kept her moving forward. This time, she would not make the same mistakes. The plan was set. She would leave in the dead of night once more, when the moon cast a pale light over the fields and the night air was thick with the sounds of crickets. She knew the risks, but she also knew that the outside world held the key to her freedom and her children's salvation. With each step away from the plantation, she felt both the weight of her past and the possibility of a future. Freedom, a life beyond the bonds of slavery, and the chance to reunite with her children. Sallie's journey was not easy, and it began with a fear so great that it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She had no map, no clear destination, and no guarantee that she would find safety along the way. The world beyond the plantation was unfamiliar and full of dangers she could not predict. She had to rely on nothing but her wits, her courage, and the small, secret network of abolitionists, runaway slaves, and sympathetic individuals who had helped others escape. But even this network, fragile as it was, could offer little more than temporary shelter and fleeting moments of hope. The path ahead was filled with uncertainty. Sallie moved through dense forests, trudged through marshes, and crossed rivers, all the while keeping to the shadows, hidden from the prying eyes of slave catchers and the law. She couldn't afford to rest during the day for fear of being spotted by anyone who might turn her in. She moved only at night, when the darkness provided a cloak for her escape. Every rustle in the woods, every crack of a twig beneath her feet was a potential threat. The sound of footsteps in the distance, the howls of dogs, or the distant voices of people on patrol were enough to send her heart racing with fear. The hunger and exhaustion that gripped her body seemed to worsen with each passing day. She was far from the warmth and security of her previous life on the plantation, and now every resource was scarce. She had no provisions with her and relied solely on her ability to forage. The constant search for food became one of the most grueling aspects of the journey. Berries, roots, and the occasional scraps of food left behind by others were all that kept her alive. Her body weakened and the physical toll began to show. Her skin grew pale and gaunt, her muscles strained with each movement, and yet her determination remained unshaken. Sallie encountered a series of individuals along the way, some who offered kindness and assistance, while others betrayed her trust in exchange for money or favors. In some of the small, seemingly safe villages she passed through, she met people who, though they were sympathetic to her plight, were too afraid to offer any real help. Fear of the law, fear of the bounty on runaways, kept many from offering more than fleeting refuge. Still, Sallie's resilience kept her moving forward, even when it seemed as though every door was closed, every hand was withdrawn. Once, in a small town, she was offered a meal by a kind woman who saw the desperation in her eyes. They exchanged no words, only the quiet understanding of shared humanity. But as quickly as the kindness had appeared, it vanished. When Sallie asked for directions to the north, the woman hesitated and then, without a word, turned away, leaving Sallie to feel the sting of the woman's unspoken fear. It was moments like this that cut deep, those brief flashes of hope that quickly turned to dust, leaving her to wonder if she was truly alone in the world. But betrayal was not the only hardship she faced. Sallie had to endure the brutal elements, rainstorms that drenched her to the bone, wind that whipped through her ragged clothing, and the unrelenting heat of the summer that sapped her energy. The journey felt endless, the miles seeming to stretch farther than they actually were. With each step, she was not only moving towards freedom, but also closer to the possibility of failure. The risk was ever present. At any moment she could be captured, beaten, or even killed. Yet, each time Sallie paused to rest, a renewed sense of urgency gripped her. The thought of her children, wherever they were, kept her moving. Despite the dangers, Sallie encountered moments of humanity that helped her keep going. A farmer, though wary of her, gave her a ride in his cart for a few miles. A man in a small cabin offered her shelter for the night, though he warned her not to stay too long. These moments of kindness were fleeting, yet they kept her from despair. The small gestures of goodwill reminded her that not everyone was complicit in the system of oppression. They reminded her that there were those who would risk everything to help someone like her, even if it was just for a moment. Her journey was a constant battle of hope and despair. At times, Sallie felt as if she was walking through an endless maze of uncertainty, always moving forward, but never knowing whether she was closer to freedom or closer to capture. Each day was a struggle against exhaustion, hunger, and the nagging fear that at any moment her luck would run out. But there was a quiet strength that grew inside her. With each passing mile, Sallie became more adept at reading the world around her, more skilled at hiding in plain sight, more certain of her mission. Her connection to her children and her unwavering belief that they were still out there, waiting for her, kept her going. She could not, would not turn back. As the journey stretched on, Sallie's resolve grew even stronger. The world outside the plantation had proven to be far more dangerous and unforgiving than she had imagined. She was not just running for her own freedom anymore, she was running for the future of her children. Each step she took brought her closer to the day when she could finally hold them in her arms again, when she could provide them with the life they had always deserved. But the journey was far from over. Sallie was not yet free, not yet reunited with her children, and the dangers she faced were as present as ever. Yet her determination was unshakable. She pressed on no matter the cost, no matter the obstacles in her path. For Sallie, the road to freedom was long, filled with hardship and pain, but it was also the only road worth taking. And with each new step, she inched closer to the freedom she had dreamed of for so long, a future where her children could know peace, love, and a life free from the chains of slavery. After countless trials, countless miles of painful travel, and innumerable moments of uncertainty, Sallie Crane finally reached the border of the Free States. She had crossed the invisible line that separated the terror of slavery from the hope of freedom. It was a milestone that many never saw, a triumph for which she had paid dearly. Her body, though free, still carried the scars of her past, physical wounds from whippings, mental scars from betrayal, emotional wounds from the heartbreak of losing her children, and the constant fear of being hunted down. The road to this point had been long and fraught with dangers, but at last she stood on the precipice of a new life, or so it seemed. As she crossed into the Free States, the weight that had crushed her for so long began to lift. For the first time in years, she could breathe without the constant fear of being discovered, punished, or sold. The air, though still thick with the remnants of her trauma, felt like it had a touch of freedom in it. The night sky, once a looming, dark void that represented danger, now seemed more open, more inviting, and full of possibilities. Sallie had finally escaped the clutches of slavery, but the scars of her past were not so easily erased. Her transition from a life of constant fear and suffering to one of hope and freedom was anything but easy. The journey had taken a toll on her in ways she had not fully understood at the time. Even though she had escaped the physical bonds of slavery, the emotional and psychological toll was deep and persistent. The years of abuse, the trauma of being separated from her children, the constant battle for survival, it all left a lasting imprint on her soul. Sallie was free, but she was not unscathed. The weight of her experiences, the memories of her children, and the cruel system that had oppressed her for so long would continue to haunt her. In those first days and weeks of freedom, Sallie struggled to find a sense of normalcy. Her new life, though vastly different from the one she had known, still felt foreign. She was no longer under the watchful eyes of the overseers or enslavers, but the world she had entered was equally alien. She found shelter and refuge with those who were part of the underground network that had helped so many enslaved individuals escape. These brave people had risked everything to provide assistance, offering food, shelter, and guidance to those who had nowhere else to turn. Sallie was now among them, but the idea of settling down and creating a new life for herself seemed distant and unattainable. The fear and pain she carried with her from the plantation made it difficult to imagine ever feeling truly at peace. The trauma she had endured didn't vanish when she crossed into freedom. It followed her, silently but ever present. Sallie struggled with nightmares, moments of panic, and a sense of isolation. The world outside the plantation was not a sanctuary. It was merely another part of the journey. She did not know what her future would hold, but her desire to reunite with her children gave her a sense of direction. They were the driving force that kept her moving forward, the reason she could not stop, even when everything within her told her to rest. Her children were still somewhere out there, lost to her in a world that had sought to destroy them, and her quest to find them did not end with her own escape. Her freedom would be incomplete until she had them in her arms again. Sally's story did not follow the typical narrative of a dramatic fairy tale reunion. The reality of her situation was more complicated, filled with continuing hardships, unexpected obstacles, and the painful recognition that freedom did not come with its own set of challenges. She could not simply walk into a new life and forget the horror she had left behind. In fact, many of the challenges she faced were tied directly to the circumstances of her past. There were no guarantees that her children were still alive, no promises that she would ever be able to find them. Yet, her determination was unshakable. With every passing year, she continued her search, refusing to let the hope of reunion fade. Her search for her children was not in vain, but it was filled with its own set of heartbreaks. Sally managed to learn where her children had been sold, and though the path to them was difficult and filled with constant setbacks, she never gave up. She worked tirelessly, and through connections, through people who had supported the cause of freedom, she managed to track them down. But the reunion was not a joyous occasion in the way one might expect. By the time Sally finally found her children, they had been deeply affected by their own experiences under slavery. They were no longer the innocent children she had known. The emotional scars were as deep as those that Sally herself carried, and the reunion, while filled with relief and love, was also a painful reminder of the emotional and psychological toll that slavery had inflicted upon them all. In the years that followed, Sally did not simply rest on her laurels as a freedwoman. She became an active voice in the abolitionist movement, a symbol of resistance and survival. She used her story to inspire others, to show that no matter how brutal the system of slavery was, the human spirit could never be fully broken. Sally's journey from enslaved to free was not just about escaping her chains. It was about finding her voice, reclaiming her identity, and fighting for a world where no one else would have to endure the same suffering she did. In her final years, Sally became a living testament to the strength and resilience of the human spirit. Her legacy endured not only in the physical freedom she had fought for, but also in the hope she inspired in others. Her story spread far and wide, becoming a beacon of hope for those who sought freedom in the face of oppression. She was a symbol of the power of love, the unbreakable force of a mother's determination, and the resilience of a soul that refused to be broken. Sally's legacy was not just about one woman's quest for freedom. It was about the enduring power of hope, the unbreakable bond of family, and the refusal to give up, no matter the cost. Her story became an inspiration for generations to come, a beacon of hope for those who continue to fight against injustice. Her life, marked by struggle and sacrifice, stands as a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most insurmountable odds.